This is the new physics of electrical engineering, the new electrical engineering. Now that I've spent 13 months studying surge circuits in Paul Falstad's electronic simulator and listening to Eric Dollard and whatnot, I can go now to the conventional wisdom and simply redefine the terms. Nothing wrong with the terms, so long as we understand what they really mean. And free energy is kind of a weird term because there's nothing free about it, because you still have to pay in the form of the circuit. The circuit's going to be problematic, it's going to have details that you're not familiar with, so it's hardly free. There's work involved. But like Eric says, we can either synthesize or we can decompose electrical energy. And it's all based on the term reactance. So now we have two types of reactances. One which synthesizes electricity and one which decomposes it. The one which decomposes it is inductive reactance, and the one which synthesizes it is capacitive reactance. Nothing wrong with the term, just so long as we understand what it means. Now, in a capacitor, because that's what we want to focus on, right, is the creation of energy. It's a very interesting anomaly, because the more we have capacitive reactance, the more we're going to synthesize electricity. While in the case of an inductor, the more inductive reactance we have, the more we're going to wipe out the energy that we have, regardless of where we got it from or how we got it. It's going to destroy it. Now I noticed that in the Power Factor 2 circuit, the default circuit when you go to my website, vinyasi.info/NE, and if you change the scopes, because I had them all in watts, but if you change it back to volts and amps for each component in the circuit, other than the wire, the capacitor in the circuit and the inductor and AC source together as a pair, because they behave the same way, each of those two sets of components shifts the amps relative to the volts by 90 degrees. The AC source actually does it, but the inductor does too, in the same direction. And I forget which is which, but I'll take a guess estimate that the capacitor shifted the amps ahead of the volts by 90 degrees, while the AC source and the inductor shifted the volts ahead of the amps by 90 degrees. And it kind of makes sense, because why does that make sense? Well, let's leave that alone for the minute, because that's a little complicated. So, let me get to the point that I wanted to get to first, though. And then if I feel like it, I'll get to that one, because it's just a question of thinking it through. And sometimes taking pencil to paper if that's required to help the little noggin do its job. Okay. So the point of this video is that if we increase the, let's see if I have this right. If we increase the capacitive reactance, we have to look at it from the point of view, now we have to switch back to the terminology of Eric Dollard to see what that means, to give it new meaning. And instead of crapping on it, instead of feeling badly about it, you know. So when let's see, when the counterspatial distance increases for the capacitor, the analogy is that the spatial distance diminishes, yet it's that increased distance of transit for the longitudinal wave that increases capacitive reactance, and that's when the farads go up in the capacitor, and the thinness of the dielectric material in the middle of the capacitor continues to get thinner and thinner and thinner, because in the case of capacitive reactance, space and counterspace are in opposition. They are inversely related. So what we see in space, the opposite is happening in counterspace. And that's what makes electrical engineering a little difficult. Because electricity, according, I believe, if I have this right, according to Eric Dollard, exists in both worlds simultaneously. Both in the world of counterspace and in the world of space. But inductive reactance is in conjunction with the space and counterspace is in conjunction with each other. But again, in the inductive reactance area, electricity exists in both worlds simultaneously. And it's the same for all the other components. But unlike inductive reactance and capacitive reactance, the reaction of a resistor is simply that no shift occurs between the amps and the volts. So when I scoped each of the three components in the Power Factor 2 circuit, I was amazed that each component responded differently, and it didn't matter what the other components were doing. It had absolutely no effect whatsoever. So it shows that each component is a world unto itself. And you can't use any one component to get the correct picture of what's happening in the circuit overall, because it skews the perspective along its line of reasoning, shall we say. Because, electrical engineering, or electricity I should say, is consciousness at a very simplistically fundamental level, in which there's very few elements involved, and so the electricity can't function in a conscious way in a very sophisticated manner, such as we can. But remember, I've gone over this before, that if the substrate of reality is infinity, and all we're doing is dividing it up into this imaginary idea that we can divide up infinity into multiple infinities, then we start counting those multiple infinities, and we call those multiple infinities by various names depending on the circumstances: watts, amps, pounds, inches. Yet it's all infinity at its very core nature, which is another way of saying it's God. Or I should say, actually, not God, it's the substance by which God is made of. Because God has its own personality, characteristic personality, quite distinct from ours or a rock. So personality has to do with the structure of this individuation of infinity, or being, existence. But we never think of existence as infinity. We never think of it as the same substance that God is made of. We think, oh, a lowly rock. Well, yeah, in terms of personality, yeah. But not in terms of its fundamental substrate of material existence, which is absolute. It's transcendental. It's infinity. Yet when it's divided up into a individuated structural composition, now it's not it's not a whitewash of infinity. Now it's infinity with character, with style, with panache. The panache of a rock, or the panache of a saint, and everything else in between, and beyond a saint for that matter, and before a rock. The whole gamut of creation is the variety by which the infinite substrate of existence can be subdivided into various forms and phenomena, creating the illusion, that's why it's called Maya, that something other than infinity is taking place. And of course the only problem is identifying with that process to such a degree that we forget what it's made out of. It's very easy to forget. When you get immersed in Maya, it's very easy to forget where Maya ultimately comes from. It comes from infinity. Even Maya is essentially infinity. Even Maya. Even illusion. It would have to be. Or else it wouldn't be infinity, right? It'd be something less than infinity if it couldn't take on every single possible existential nature that we could possibly imagine. It would be something less than infinity if it couldn't do that, if it had a limitation of any sort. But in electrical engineering, the relationships between the various forces of electrical nature are very simplistic, yet they are coordinated in a very distinct fashion, as Eric Dollard likes to point out. And we get the verification from the conventional view of conventional terms, provided we always keep Eric Dollard's vision in focus, or in the background. But, well, always there, present. Let's put it that way. Yeah, that's a better way to put it. Always present. So Eric Dollard's vision can never leave us as we slide in and out of his vernacular or conventional vernacular. It makes no difference, the vernacular that we use. But his perspective has to remain dominant because it fills in all the gaps that we didn't know existed in our understanding. Conventional wisdom gives us a little bit of knowledge and then immediately plunges us into mathematical equations whose sole purpose is engineering devices, not understanding where the engineering arises from. It has to arise from the archetypes of electricity, its character, its characteristic qualities, and we're missing a few. And it's not too complicated, but, you know, we do have to keep them in mind when we're thinking about, okay, now how do I engineer this thing, you know, before we step into the equations that are going to be required of us to do the actual engineering. We have to understand what the significance of what we're doing in its simplest terms. So, increasing capacitive reactance. Now wait a minute. No, I think I may have it wrong. Let me see if I get this right. Well, there's two aspects to capacitive reactance. See, that's it. There's two extremes. Let's put it that way. There's two extreme aspects. One is the increase, and the other is the decrease. Because remember, the weirdness of capacitance is that the relationship between space and counter space are in opposition. And so in the field of capacitance, it's very important to be cognizant of that opposition. While in the field of inductance, there's nothing much to focus on because everything is in conjunction. So if we talk about one aspect, the counterspatial aspect, it's the same as if we're talking about the spatial. And that's probably why we get the two confused, as if there's no distinction between them. And thus we ignore counter space, and we just focus on space as if space were the only existential reality to electrical engineering. You know, in other words, when you engineer the circuit, all you have to do is think about its spatial considerations. Not when we get to the capacitor, but if we're dealing with inductance, yeah. And so the emphasis played upon inductive reactance dominates the field, and it's a skewed vision of reality. And that's why people don't understand free energy, and that's why the physicist said to Jim Murray, when Jim Murray asked, well, yeah, but what you just showed me, the data, and I hired you to analyze the circuit and tell me what's happening, and you recognize the data indicates over unity. So what do you make of it? What's going on? And the physicist said, I'll get back to you. And that was 35 or plus years ago. And Jim Murray has yet to hear diddly squat from the physicist, because they're not trained to think about capacitive reactance, the way Eric Dollard thinks about it, that space and counter space are in opposition, and that means there is another reality just as significant as space, especially so in the field of the capacitor, in which it's doing the opposite in counter space as what's happening in space. So that's why we have to focus on the capacitor more than anything, because we already know what the inductor does in space, and it's doing the same thing in counter space when it does it in space. So there's really no need to focus on inductive reactance. And what is inductive reactance? Well, when we talk about back EMF, isn't that inductive reactance? When we talk about the collapse of the field of a coil as distinct from its back EMF, isn't that inductive reactance? It's all inductive reactance, but it's so simple that there's really nothing to talk about. It's already been covered. But we have to give unduly extra attention to the capacitor because we've overlooked something, and Eric Dollard is there to point it out. And it makes it confusing because it's not the same way inductive reactance occurs. It's like mind warping to think about it. So, in a capacitor, when we make the dielectric thinner and thinner, we increase its capacitive reactance in the sense that did I say that right? No, you see, I'm screwed up. I knew it. That's why I have to talk this thing through to help me get accustomed to this new way of looking at things. When we increase the capacitive reactance, we're actually referring to counter space. See, that's the problem. Inductive reactance. Reactance, action, actance. I want to make a new word. Actance has to do with space. Reactance is the field of counter space. That's the point of this video. Reactance is the phenomenon occurring in counter space, and actance, or action, the cause, is occurring in space. But in the field of the inductor, since they're in conjunction, there's hardly anything to refer to. But in the field of the capacitor, it gets hairy. It gets fuzzy, unless we straighten it out. So, capacitive reactance is actually referring to counter space. And the increase of capacitive reactance means that the capacitor is reacting more, right? Well, in the field of the inductor, it means more inductance, which is a spatial, we know that, we increase the windings, and that's a spatial thing. It's taking up more space. And the inductive reactance goes up. The back EMF goes up. The collapse of the coil when the magnetic field gets shut off, or when the current gets shut off, is enhanced. But in the capacitor, it's not the case. Capacitive reactance goes up when the dielectric material in the capacitor gets more thin, when it starts to disappear on us in space. And that means that the longitudinal wave passing through counter space has less transit time because it has less distance to travel. It's still a fixed rate of speed. The speed of light has not been violated. It's just that, oops, the longitudinal wave doesn't exist in space. That's the field of the inductive wave, the transverse ripple wave. But the longitudinal shock wave exists solely in counter space, even though we have to do something in space to set up what the longitudinal wave will experience in its field of counter space. That's the weirdness of electrical engineering, the Alice in Wonderland of electrical engineering, the through the looking glass. So we reduce the counter space to increase capacitive reactance, but that means we have to thicken up the dielectric material, make it more thick, so that there's more spatial distance that we see, so that there'll be less counterspatial distance that the actual longitudinal wave will see and feel as it passes through it, that distance between the 2 points represented by the two conductive plates on either side of the capacitor, the 2 markers, the 2 milestone markers. And then there's the gap in between them, but the counterspatial gap has increased when we decrease the spatial gap. And that increase of distance means the longitudinal wave has to travel a longer distance at a fixed rate of the speed of light with regard to the spatial perspective. It looks, no, wait a minute. I'm sorry, the counterspatial. It has to travel a longer distance in the counterspatial, which means in the spatial, it looks like it's been accelerated. And that has an impact when that longitudinal wave converts into transverse ripple wave at the conductive plates. It has an impact on the speed of the current. And of course, speed of current is the definition of amperage. So we've just increased amperage at the junction between the dielectric material in the middle of the capacitor and its conductive plates on either side, joined with the dielectric material, fused or electroplated, however, whatever it is. So capacitive reactance is the, let's put it this way, when a capacitor overreacts, it's because the farad value is low. When a coil overreacts, inductively overreacts, it's because the henries are large. Let me say that again. When the capacitor overreacts, it's because the farads are low. Yet the dielectric material in the capacitor is going to be very thick. Which, when you think about it, is actually in conjunction with what we do with the coil. We add more windings. So at least something is mercifully in conjunction. So a high farad level on the capacitor actually means stability. Let's see if I can remember correctly what happens when we raise or lower the henries on a coil. Yeah, it tends to be, see, it's the instability of a low Henry value that helps the free energy, because the problem is now that inductance eats up what we produce. Now that's the next stage of this problem. What actually produces and what actually consumes, and the larger the Henry, the more the energy gets eaten up. What does that mean? Well, let's see. The back EMF is the reverse polarity of voltage, and it eats up the voltage. But when your voltage gets eaten up, doesn't your amps disappear? Oops. Because you got to have voltage to have pressure to drive the amps, right? Nothing that we already know has changed. We just have to add more elements to our perspective to make it slightly more complicated, so that we can be more accurate in assessing the entire situation, including over unity circuits. Because surges do exist. As much as we like to deny them, they exist. But we can also eat up electricity. We can make it disappear by making the voltage disappear, by increasing back EMF in the inductor. So, even though that doesn't look like the creation of energy, I've covered it before in a video, and I have to cover it again now to remind myself and everyone else who's listening to this that there are two ways of creating free energy. One is just put more insulation in the walls of your home. That's free energy because now you're losing less heat through the walls, and you're conserving that heat. So now you've got more free energy. And Peter Lindemann loves to point this out to people, that we've overlooked the easiest way to create free energy is to stop losing it, so much of it, because it's really a rate that can never be stopped, a rate of loss, but at least we can reduce the rate of loss. And already that's free energy right there. So the old notion of turning down the thermostat is really a source of free energy. Oddly enough. But we have to say that because that's what's going on in the inductor. If we lower the Henrys, we lose less energy, and that is free energy all by itself. And we have to say that because the capacitor is going to be busy creating free energy to some degree or another, but it's going to get chewed up by the wire and especially by the inductors. If the Henrys on the inductance is high, especially if it's high, but even if it's low, it just won't eat it up as fast as when it's low by comparison to when it's high. So when it comes to free energy, there's really two ways of looking at it. Is the cost based on the losses as well as the production. So we can't deny thermodynamics, but yet we can't deny creation of energy too. We can't. Both are real. Both exist. But creating energy is harder than conserving it. It doesn't take much skill to conserve energy. But boy, is it overlooked by people, and I'm not going to mention names. I'm not going to make this a personal issue, a personal vendetta. I got enough trouble as it is. I don't want to make it worse by focusing on it, by giving it personal relevance. Relevance. But it's true. In terms of ease, conservation is the easiest way to create free energy, is to reduce the Henrys or add insulation to the walls of our home so that we don't lose what we have. But if we have to create energy, it's the capacitor that we have to put our attention on after we've reduced the Henrys as much as we can. Now, once we understand the relationship between the capacitor and the inductor, we can afford to increase the Henrys and get away with it, because now we're creating energy to such a degree that we can't shut it off. I mean, let me put it this way. There's so much of it, it's in our face, we can't ignore it. And that's when we get to the stage of a substation, as Eric Dollard points out, 500 kVA or more, minimum, and that's when we get to lightning in a thundercloud. You never see a teensy little lightning bolt, right, that merely tickles you. It always hurts you. It always burns and starts forest fires. It's always a minimum of largesse. Why is that? Because the inductance is high to begin with. If we had lowered the inductance, like in a circuit, then it doesn't have to be so high. But can we? Should we? Would we? Do we want to? Because when we lower the inductance of a coil, it becomes more unstable. Doesn't it? No, that's not true. Actually, no. The problem was stated by more than one YouTuber. It gets harder and harder to get lower inductance, because how do you create low inductance in an actual coil? It's like really difficult. Or is it, though? I think Donald Smith had the ease with which to tell us, no, electrical engineering isn't hard once you understand it. And that's the issue of counter-winding. When you have two windings that are opposed to each other, you're already neutralizing the voltage, and you haven't even bother to increase your inductance to create more back EMF to do it that way, to eat up your voltage. No, you just counterwound, and that ate up your voltage right there. In fact, that's how AC hum is neutralized in a guitar pickup. I think it's a guitar pickup, in which they counterwind the coil inside the electric guitar, In an electric guitar, they counterwind the coil, and that's the beginning of neutralizing the AC hum that it's going to pick up plugged into the wall outlet. But they also add a slider to fine-tune that counter opposition to neutralize the AC hum. Now, what is AC? It's a voltage source. It's not a current source. At least that's not the way I understand it, because Paul Fostet's electronic simulator calls it a voltage source. It doesn't call it a current source. So when we reverse windings in equal quantity and have them on the same magnetizable core or air core, however it's done inside an electric guitar, I don't know the exact details, they're neutralizing the voltage aspect of the wave, of the AC wave. And that's a very easy way to reduce inductance. The voltage, the primary aspect of inductance is the voltage. We normally consider current to be the consequence of voltage in motion. Whereas if voltage is not in motion, if it's just sitting there, then there's no amps to speak of. It's because the volts are all tied up in one location. At least that's the way we're taught, because that's the spatial way of looking at it. I'm sure the counterspatial is completely different. Very much so. But that's why when we increase the capacitive reactance by reducing the counterspatial transit of a longitudinal wave, by increasing the spatial thickness of the dielectric material in the middle of the capacitor sandwich, when it translates into a transverse wave at the junction between the dielectric material of the capacitor and its conductive plates, it ends up having the effect of increasing the speed of the transverse ripple wave, the current, received by the seemingly accelerated longitudinal wave of counterspace inside the dielectric of the capacitor. But it did not speed up. It simply had less distance to travel between 2 points. But in opposition to the increased distance in space. So when the longitudinal wave converts into transverse wave, the inverse happens. We get increase of amperage. So I suppose if we have very thin dielectrical capacitors, in other words, capacitors of very low farads, we could get away with having a large inductor value of large henries if we counterwind the coil. And then we would have the best of both worlds in the circuit. You would think. But there's another way to look at it, and that is what I normally do in a circuit is, because I tried now, and this is something recent I've never done before. I had two air core coils, individual coils, counterwound but hooked up in parallel, and then I replaced them with a transformer. And the magnetizable core of the transformer was actually an advantage greater than the counterwinding of the coil. It gave extra oomph to take advantage of the low-level capacitor feeding that transformer of relatively or moderately higher inductance then say it's reduction. 1 Henry as opposed to 10 nanohenries. So using a 10 picofarad capacitor on either side of the primary coil of a transformer was okay, and using a transformer of 1 Henry was far superior than using a pair of parallel connected air core coils of half a Henry each, or whatever. It was the transformer is far superior because it's that magnetizable core that's really cool when in conjunction with a low farad capacitor. See, it's these relationships, and it's just a dualism, but it's a relationships. We can't just take each thing individually because it's only half of the equation anyway. I mean, an inductor is magnetism, and a capacitor is the magnetodielectric effect. Unlike most of my videos, I'm not going to repeat myself because it's so confusing. It's hard to keep track of it all. The only way to repeat myself is to say the whole thing all over again, and you could do that by replaying the video. So I'm not going to do that for you because it's really, you have to see the whole picture in order to see any part of it. I think that's the point. You can't leave any point out of it, and Eric Dollards adds the extra points that we don't get to have from conventional teaching methods. We don't appreciate what happens when we lower the farads on a capacitor, what impact that has on an inductor of very high value. We don't appreciate that. The interaction is very important, and we don't, because the policy is suppress surges and certainly don't encourage them. While I do the opposite. I encourage them, so that by the time I suppress them, I can't. All I can do is diminish them over time, so that they slowly diminish. Because so much of the circuit is already boosting the electrical phenomenon that using a snubber is lightly putting on the brakes and cannot stop it right away. And in fact, it might take quite a while to stop it. Because the rest of the circuit is creating so much momentum to the current. It can't be stopped. All it can do is be slowed down. And I'm thinking of the Pierce-Arrow circuit, the is.gd/Pierce_Arrow. The snubber circuit has very little impact, although it does have some. But once you get it up to a high value, let's say mega amps of functionality, it takes a long time to slow down to milli, micro amps, nano, pico. It takes a long time because it has so much momentum, because so much of the circuit is doing just that, building up momentum of the current instead of slowing it down. But in conventional wisdom, they tell you, get everything balanced. Balance everything. They talk about balance. Well, over unity is anything but balanced. And you really can't have balance. What they're talking about, I think, is balancing the capacitance with the inductance. And so, consequently, they rate it accordingly, And so there's no perspective of inversion, of opposition. They're trying to get everything in conjunction in order to create balance between inductance and capacitance. And the values are rated accordingly. So, but because they're rated accordingly, in order to rate them accordingly, they have to ignore counter space is in opposition to space within the realm of the capacitor. And so they get a 1/2 version of electrical reality. And that's the problem. And they're so definitely sure of it because it's been drummed in their mind and everybody else thinks so. Well, yeah, because they've been taught by the same curriculum. It's really the curriculum that's the problem, not the teachers. But it is the problem of the corporate world that's behind that curriculum. that gave the institutions that curriculum, because they gave the institutions the money. Because in the early days, there was no school system. You went and apprenticed yourself under someone who had the skills. And then there was no policy at all. And so the ether was a recognized entity for what it was worth. But policy now is the new ether. It's the dominant reality, is the man-made artificial reality of policy. Corporate policy. Which has gotten into everything, including government. So you can't really distinguish it from anything anymore, because it rules the whole planetary system of human engineering, not just electrical engineering, but human engineering in general. We've been engineered into devotees of the corporate world in order to get all the crumbs of the benefits, Buy cherries grown in South America, even though we live in North America, and get the cherries out of season. That's a corporation behind that, giving us that benefit. But it also gives us ignorance, too. Partial ignorance, But that prevents us from being sovereign in our electrical engineering, sovereign from the corporate world. In other words, self-determinism when it comes to thinking about electrical engineering. Self-determination is a very important quality, and we've lost that. And with that, we lose our freedom. And with that, we lose our free energy. So that's actually the significance of free energy. Not that we don't have to pay, because one way or another we are going to pay. There's always a payment plan. But we lose our freedom. So it's the dumb that's missing, because if we put the dumb in, we realize we're not dumb anymore. But when we take it out, that's when we become dumb, and we lose our freedom, because because we've gained dumbness and we've lost the free. And what's the word? Well, when we lose our freedom and we lose the free energy and we acquire the dumbness, we've acquired our fear of not getting paid. We've acquired poverty. And we've acquired, worse than poverty, we've acquired a reputation for being a pariah. And nobody wants a pariah, let alone pay them to do work. Because they're not doing the corporate work. They're doing their own work. You're doing your own thing over there. It's funny, DIYElectricCars.com, in their forum, they give you a little place to talk about over unity. Say, play with your little toys over there. Don't bother the rest of us doing the real work. So they have one message thread for over unity, and everything but the kitchen, including the kitchen sink, gets thrown in there, regardless of whether or not it has any value. If it claims to be over unity, there it goes in that message thread. And you don't get to play outside it in all the other threads. You don't get to create a new thread. You have to use the thread we've created for you. Well, at least they're being honest. They give you a sandbox to stay in. Far be it, though, if you get to be approved. You may not get to post. You'll post it, but it may not be read by anybody but you. Because it'll disappear once you post it. Because it will never have been approved by a moderator. Well, so I think that covers everything, right? We even covered corporate policy. It covers everything. And that, people like corporate world because it gives them additional power they didn't have otherwise, by just considering themselves, their own power level. No, they use their power level as a leverage against the corporate power, provided they go along with its policy. And then you can really squeeze your neighbor, and then, before you know it, we're all thinking the same way. We have to. Or we end up homeless on the street, like Eric Dollard and, And then we gripe about, oh, the world is so cruel. Yeah, it's true. The corporate world is a heartless beast. Very efficient, though. That's its strength. It's highly efficient when it comes to managerial characteristics and administration. But the policy that is administered is anything but heartfelt and full of compassion and mercy and humanistic and kind to the animals. You know, if it wasn't for the corporate world, we wouldn't have lab testing on animals. And then we wouldn't have protesters protesting that either. And it's cruelty being thrown at each other from both directions, but all because it was initiated by the profit margin of a corporate perspective, which is forget about the feelings of the bunny rabbits when you put eye drops in the eyes to see how much they tear up. You know, how irritating is the eye drop solution, the chemistry, by quantifying the number of tears coming out of that poor rabbit's eyes. And how much can, it be tolerated by the rabbit will be the decision for how much to tolerate the imperfection of that drug for human use. Well, it's tolerable. Okay, we can sell it and make a profit. That's why my reality of electrosensitivity and to some degree physiological sensitivity is not part of the corporate world, and so there's no really niche for me, although there is if I intelligently swim in the market. But if I don't read the label, then I grab the wrong product, then whoops, I got to take it back, and I don't have the receipt. Oh my God, I have to do an even exchange or buy something more than what I'm buying to get any credit for what I'm trying to return. That's not, it's a complicated, obviously, but it all points to the same policy. Regardless of how it expresses itself, it's the same policy. It's the same agenda. Run by the same entity that we suck up to. And that's the problem with free energy. It's not in the best interests of the corporate perspective, so it's been phased out of our life. Freedom, the freedom of electricity has been phased out. And you have to think of it, the surge is the epitome of freedom. It's the wild stallion that has never known a human master, a human owner. It just wants to run like the wind, more like lightning, but it just wants to run and gallop and have a mind of its own and run free across the plains. That's the way I love to look at a surge, is the freedom in its personality is really prominent, and its self-determination along with that freedom is very prominent. So maybe we should stop calling it free energy and instead call it freedom energy. Or just plain call it freedom, because that's what the energy is experiencing when it turns into a surge, is total freedom. Total lack of control. And it'll do whatever it wants to do when it wants to do it, and it's never going to look to you for advice or guidance. Could care. A human electrical engineer, they actually exist. What do I care? I'm going to end up doing my own thing anyway, unless they get in my way. And then I'm going to try to bore a hole through whatever barrier they put in my way. And if they're good at what they do, they put a big wall, and the poor energy gets all... It gets bound up, and it's no longer free to do its thing whenever it wants to. And I only try to bring in a little bit of coercion, because I know better. If I want the benefit of the freedom of electrical energy... See, that's it. We've taken too many words out of the equation, and that's why it looks stupid. Free energy is very stupid because of the lack of words. The freedom of electricity to do as it pleases. It's a whole phrase. It's a whole sentence. But that's the only way to talk about it and use the word free in there in an accurate manner, is that we have to bring back the words that were torn out. The freedom of energy to be self-deterministic. Not just self-reliant, and not just self-sufficient, but self-deterministic. To have a mind of its own. And it does. It has a consciousness. It's alive. The circuit is alive because the electrical energy is life force in its own right, in its own way of manifestation. The intelligence of the physiology of our body and mind adds an element of intelligence so that it's not totally randomized, so that our heartbeat is somewhat regular. But Eric Dollard has said that the impulses of the neurons are the unidirectional DC impulses that Tesla studied and called it radiant energy. It's the same thing. The nervous system runs on impulses, on impulse current. I should say that, on impulse current, because we can get that mixed up with a pulsed DC force, so it's best to say impulse current and not get it mixed up. There is a distinct difference, even though it's kind of similar. It sounds similar. No, it's not the same. See, there's a problem. There's all sorts of problems to the way we look at electrical engineering because the vernacular is stilted one way and one way only, and we have to tweak the vernacular slightly, just slightly. We don't have to give it up and all the laws of physics that goes with it. We just have to tweak it a little bit. So when we say that Eric Dollard broke the speed of light, he really didn't. Not in the field of counterspace where the longitudinal wave exists. It just looks that way in the spatial half of the perspective of a longitudinal wave. The spatial consequence. It looks like the longitudinal wave sped up, when in reality it's still traveling at the same rate, the same speed. It just has less distance in counter space, but in order to have less distance in counter space, it has to have greater distance in space. And when it translates into a transverse wave, that's when this so-called anomaly becomes recognized. The anomaly being not the electricity, but our understanding of it. That's the anomaly. And on that note, I'm going to shut up.